Ma'am, we are live.
Okay, thanks, Shubham. Shuruchi, we could start now, I think.
Sure. Okay. Good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure today to welcome you to this very exciting event on behalf of the Jindal School of Journalism and Communication. The event is called Afghanistan in Ink, Color, and Sound. And so we are also very happy to be, collaborating this event with the Center for Afghanistan Studies, which is also a part of OP Jindal Global University, and also Simorg Center Gweth Institute in Delhi. So this is actually a two-day event. Today, we are going to have a very exciting panel discussion. And tomorrow, we are going to have an audio documentary known as Afghan Voices. Before I hand it over to the moderators, just to give you a brief idea on what encouraged us to organize this event. As we all know, there remains a tremendous global interest in Afghanistan as a country, and because it witnessed decades of conflict and also the current crisis. So we bring together global voices who aim to address both the past and the present of the region. So we are not really aiming to look at it only through the lens of the current crisis, but we're trying to kind of take a critical view of the region from diverse global voices. So, without further delay, I would just, hand it over to my colleague, Bilkis Dodd. She's a lecturer with the Jindal School of International Affairs, and she's also an assistant director with the Center for Afghanistan Studies at OP Jindal Global University. And also the second panel will be moderated by our very own Riju Ray, who is also, along with me, who's also a faculty at the Jindal School of Journalism and Communication. So, without further delay, I'll just, hand it over to Bilkis.
Thank you so much. I really, before moderating the session, I really want to congratulate my colleagues at the School of Journalism and Communication for organizing such an important and unique event. And as you all know that for the last 2.5 months, many sounds in Afghanistan have fallen silent. The ink in the pen of many intellectuals and journalists have been drained out. The colors of Afghanistan have sought to be painted over in black and white canvas. This is all that don't represent what Afghanistan is about, right? So the art, literature, and activism are both the soul and conscience keeper of a society, and hence it is no surprise that they are under attack. The roundtable discussion today with 3 very eminent voices will bring to life aspects of art, literature, and activism in Afghanistan as they see it. It's very important for us to have many more such conversations as Afghanistan fades away from the news headlines, unfortunately. So today we have the 3 very important speakers. I'm just going to introduce them, briefly. The first speaker that we have with us is Seistela Thief. She is a queer Afghan working class artist, facilitator, and consultant. Her works and collaboration have been presented by Why Not Theatre, Colfer Center for the Arts, and many others. And she is a published playwright and voiced the character Suraya in the Oscar-nominated animated film The Breadwinner. And Latifa's work explores the politics of inclusion and class. Thank you so much for joining us. The second speaker that we have today is Nemat Sadat. He's an Afghan queer rights activist, journalist, and author of the book The Carpet Weaver, published by Penguin Random House, India. Right now he's also writing his second novel titled Keeping Up with the Habsburgs. He has taught previously in the American University of Afghanistan and worked with Canadian International Development Agency. And the third speaker that we have today is Teren Han, who is a journalist and writer based in Mumbai. She's the author of Shadow City, A Woman Walks Kabul. And, her works have been widely published in India and internationally, such as in Al Jazeera. And from 2006 to 2013, Han spent long periods living and working in Kabul. Thank you so much for joining us. Just a reminder that each speaker gets 8 minutes, and then we will go to the discussion with the participant and with each other. So Seistela Thief, I just give the floor to you. Thank you.
I feel free to intercept with any questions or any need for clarity. So I guess what I can do is just break down a little bit of my work and where I'm coming from. Yep. So I'm based in Canada, living on stolen Indigenous land. My parents arrived as refugees in 1987 from Afghanistan, from being, displaced and forced out of their country by so many different influences. And they were also very much involved in politics and were very active. So they had also stayed behind for a number of years because they also didn't want to leave their homeland or their people, right? But as a necessity of family having to leave, and also my mother being pregnant, they decided to come to Toronto. So they came here, through legal means, whatever you want to call that, and settled into Toronto. So a lot of my work is really about asking this question of who gets to have the right to talk about a history of war, and who gets to document this history of war. So, and then for myself as a child of diaspora who was not born and raised in Afghanistan, who did not grow in the politics of it, who did not have to encounter the different experiences there, like my work is very, subjected to what it feels like to grow up in Canada under colonial rule, and having to be very much responsible for not only my parents' memories, but my cultures and my country's history. And for me, that's it's a very heavy burden. I think in many ways, I think it's also an incredible responsibility. I also think it's an avenue to wield, the access and the privilege that you may have being outside of the country, to make sure that voices from back home are listened to. But, an aspect of growing up in the West also has meant for me to check and understand my own indoctrinations and my own biases, not only as a citizen, of this land that's been stolen, but on top of it, as an Afghan, as a female, what do I think of back home, having not lived there? Why do I have this responsibility of creating a voice for women back home? And at times, when I'm interviewed about my work or having discussion about my work, sometimes I'm asked very boldly, and this is mostly from white journalists who come outside of our experiences of being from Asia, saying, will your work help women in Afghanistan? And that's, for me, that's a very absurd question, because I'm a very, quote unquote, privileged access living, privileged artist living in the West. Like, how could my work directly support women in Afghanistan? And also this hyper focus on women in Afghanistan being these, helpless women who don't have their own activism, don't have their own demands, don't have their own pursuits and their own desires and passions to build for their homeland, that they have to be dependent on Western interlocutors like myself to give them voice. That's what it kind of points to. So, for my thing is, like, I always return to saying, well, there's a lot of women who are endangered around the world, because patriarchy is a global phenomena that has affected everyone. And then also over here, we have murdered and missing Indigenous women that are not accounted for because they're not even humanized. So my work is very much confrontational, and purposely situates myself in these experiences. And should I stop for a second? Does anyone need to clarify or? And if I'm speaking too fast, please let me know.
No. That's really nice. Actually, I just have a comment and a question here. I'm sorry to disturb you. It's very interesting to listen to you. So, as you talked about the role of women and how Afghan women have been kind of, portrayed in the media. So, what do you see? Like how your feelings have changed since the Taliban took over?
I'm honestly still in the shock of my life watching that unfold, because, when 9/11 happened, I was 13 years old. It was my first week of high school. And it was it felt like the end of the world, to many of us. And it was very heightened. And because I was grown in the West, and Toronto, New York was similar, there was a lot of intensity around that time. And then to see 20, 21 years later, like, the lack of advancement in how narratives are being told, the lack of journalistic integrity, the lack of proper media attention, the hyper focus on, like, again, what was said during, the initiation for the war on terror, that we must go and save the women. We must go save the women, that the women were always used as some kind of segue to justify their violent imperialist, presence in that country and their extraction. But, they never really attempted to help progress, women or advance them, but also women there, if people were left to their own devices, if they were able to be respected to be their own sovereign nation, then the people themselves can decide what is best for their own homeland. My point as being a diaspora is not to speak for back home, is to really point and say, I am also a product of this displacement, right? And what happens to many of us is that, you become there's different kinds of displacements. There's displacement where you become the voice of your country and your homeland in a way that you are used as a tool of Western dominance to tell very biased narratives. And then there's the other aspect of being displaced to the point where you become a submissive person because you've seen the incredible violence, because you've seen what has happened. You become a different kind of indentured worker in the West because you know how difficult it is. So this kind of line of gratitude of being grateful for, being in a colonial land and being a product is also very confusing. And one more thing that I'll say, when I put in my bio that I voiced the character Soraya in this animated movie, it is not a point of pride for me. It is not a point of pride for me. It is a political decision for me to put it in there. And I took that role in a political decision because I wanted to see very closely in terms of how a Hollywood machine or a Hollywood kind of, mechanism would work in terms of how they tell the story. The main female, the little girl, is played by a young Indian girl, who's a very popular TV star, right? So what does that mean when you don't have the main character played by a young Afghan girl, right? And then you have the other interlocutors who are like Afghan, voice actors as well, or artists. But then you have that movie, if anyone's familiar with it, they don't really talk about the invasion. They don't really talk about the Soviets. They don't really talk about American intervention, or military presence. It really focuses on the plight of women and the Taliban in a very specific way that avoids any kind of political discourse. Right. So I thought it was really fascinating as, what I consider myself as a political artist, as naively as possible here, is that it's also hard for me to say political because I can say as many things as I want to here, but I know that there won't be the kind of consequences that I would face elsewhere. So I also question, like, to what extent can I identify as a political person? Because, does it make it more political when there's a risk? And what are the risks associated for me, shooting my mouth off about these topics in comparison to, all the wonderful and, journalists and media people from Afghanistan who have been literally silenced, have been pushed into marginalization, have been pushed into exile. So it's just always a fight and a confrontation for me. So some of my work is in a gallery where I ask these questions, and I work with items and objects that are seen as immigrant trope items, and then sometimes it's performance lectures where I get to break down the history of how I've been engaged with as an Afghan artist and how much it takes to kind of remove yourself from the indoctrination and to realize that on every level, we are being manipulated to tell a narrative that is inaccurate. I hope that answers. I think that's 8 minutes. Has it been 8 minutes?
You still have 2 3 minutes if you want to.
I have 2 3 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. I think this, this thing, the question that you asked, Bilkas, about the Taliban and seeing their presence again, it is very surreal because on one hand there was so much rhetoric online about sanctioning Pakistan, for having a presence there, and there's no, for me there is no denying the state of Pakistan being involved in the politics of Afghanistan and the government and its demise in different ways. But I also have a parent who has also been, displaced a second time in their life and had to leave Kabul and had to leave my grandmother behind and my family behind in order to return to Canada. So I have a mother who has been displaced twice in her life, not only when she was pregnant with me, but again, 21 years after the war on terror, having to leave her homeland because she didn't want to go. She doesn't want to leave. She came back so she could stay and have that. And then I go, what does it feel like to be in your 50s, to be, displaced and made an exile a second time, right? So I'm still in utter shock. I'm in a lot of sadness. I worry about a lot of the artists and thinkers, and not to create a hierarchy, because I know there's a lot of rhetoric too about there's a brain drain, that all the best and the most intelligent people are leaving the country. I don't necessarily believe that either, because I also believe that's really dangerous thing of discounting and diminishing people that have been left behind because they're not able to access their departure. They don't have the money. But when I think often of the most marginalized communities, the Azara communities, that are back home, like they were also not able to leave because they were on the lower rung of society, but they were also very much part of rebuilding what Afghanistan has been the last 20, 30 years, after this period of war, established a university, got to higher levels of education. And then you see with the Taliban rule that they are exposed once again to, severe violence and, genocide once more. So it's very, very hard. My heart really breaks, but then that means that my positionality as a Westerner has to become even more critical in some way, but also I have to have an even deeper responsibility as an artist to make sure that if I have the ability to create work, that I'm highlighting people's work that is not of my own, that is of people of back home. So how do I make sure that it's pointed to their literature, to their media, to their understanding? And my job is merely as a guide, as a facilitator, to point that way, not to redirect the attention towards myself and my personal story, because that is oftentimes the case with diaspora artists, is that they're forced to tell stories of their parents or their grandparents' memories without talking about, what kind of, class location did they have? What kind of access did they have? Did they grow up in Kabul versus, the outer city or the outer provinces, where a lot of people, with the communist intervention as well, had gone through a lot of poverty and grief, who were also reacting to that. You had that change of government. So it's a very hostile field of representation that I have to navigate. So because I'm not allowed to just exist as a human being based on where I'm from and my identity, then I've made it my job to make all aspects of my life a type of confrontational unraveling of how much I've been made a product of this violence.
Thank you so much, Seistela Thief.
Thank you.
I'm sure we have lots of points to take it up in discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I would like to invite Teren Han to please take over, please, and talk a little bit about her work.
Hi, yeah. Thank you so much. I'll start by saying thank you, Bilqis, and all the organizers of the session. Thank you for having me as part of this discussion. And it's a real pleasure to hear you, Seistela. It's such an interesting way to start this conversation. Thank you for sharing those stories and your perspective. I'm an Indian, I'm not Afghan. I've written about Kabul deeply. I've spent a lot of time there since 2006 to 13. I worked there for, long durations of time. I feel very close to the city. I have many, many dear friends who belong there, who left, some who are still there. So I think this is a moment when we are all kind of reckoning with this moment in history, with our personal relationship with places, and also our job as writers. So it's a really interesting and valuable conversation, I think, for me to have as someone who's had this relationship with Kabul now. I can't really speak for the rest of the country. It's obviously a much more complicated picture once you leave the capital. But even within Kabul, there's so much to unravel, I think. So thank you for organizing this, and thank you for letting me be a part of it. I'm a journalist and a nonfiction writer, and I think I'm assuming many of the people who are listening today are also engaged with journalism or are studying journalism in some way, have an interest in this area, in this field of nonfiction writing. I'm definitely going to take less than 8 minutes, but I just want to talk a little about the writing of places that are marked by war, which is what Kabul was and is for me, and how my perspective, sort of similar to what Seistela said, but from the other side, from the Indian side. When I went to Kabul for the first time in 2006, I went there to work on a project to work with media persons, and I loved it. I really found the city to be absolutely fascinating, and I was with my husband and another friend, and we just kept finding ways to go back over and over again. And this continued until 2013. And I think what I learned through that time, I was writing for Indian publications, also publications internationally. And all of these were what this work kind of grew into a book, which is called Shadow City, A Woman Walks Kabul. And the perspective of my book, which I chose to take, was that of a person on foot exploring the city. And I think that appealed to me in talking about this city, because it was so easy to be there and yet not be there. There were so many people who lived in Kabul or who worked in Kabul, especially people from abroad, who really saw it in a very truncated way. Often not because they chose to do it, but because, as the security situation deteriorated, security guidelines came up and they were, sort of sequestered behind increasing security measures. So for me, the idea of being on foot was an interesting one. It was a rich idea as well, because I grew up in the north of India, in a small town, but what we call a small town in India. It's not really small. So the idea of being a woman out on the streets of my hometown was just a very unusual one when I was growing up. You couldn't just walk around for fun. It wasn't like my male cousins could just go hang out. For women, this was not an option. You had to have a reason for leaving the house, and always to show that reason even in the way you carried your body, or your body posture, the way you walk. It had to have a sense of urgency. So loitering or just hanging around on the streets was not a thing. And so when I got to Kabul, almost the very first thing I was told was, you should never walk here. And this was not because I was a woman, but this was because I had come from abroad, but because I had this complicated relationship with walking as a Indian woman, this landed very differently for me. And it was a way in which the city kind of felt familiar. And I thought, well, this is something I've heard before, so maybe I know how to explore the city as well. So it was this strange kind of relationship which felt both familiar and also, of course, new. And as I started writing my book, I realized that this was a good vehicle also for the many layers of Kabul that I was finding, which were really informed in a way by the fact that I am an Indian woman and I could relate to it through more diverse sources than what I had initially taken, which were mostly English writing about Afghanistan. And I also had this fantastic resource, which was my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, who had never been to Kabul, but he knew the city with a great level of intimacy and with a great level of affection, because he had read about it so deeply. He could read Persian, and he had a sense of connection of this cultural arc that joined us from India all the way into Afghanistan, and I would say even further. He was my guide in a very, very real, though metaphorical way. So it was like he built this bridge from his study room in India, in Aligarh, to Kabul, and I would go to Kabul, I would spend time there, I would see things, and then I would come back and tell him about it, and he would then tell me things about what I had seen, And this way the city just grew between us, between these shared stories from the past, from fables, from mythology. And I realized that this was an interesting way to walk through Kabul also. And of course, the whole time I would be listening to stories of Kabulis talking about their memories or telling me stories that they had heard as children or describing the city to me when they were young or what they remembered of it. And then, of course, there was films in the archives, for instance, Afghan film archives that I saw that told me a story of a completely different city. So there were all these iterations of Kabul that I would keep encountering. And I realized that these were also walks and explorations of the nature that felt very revelatory. So this is what I used in my book to write about Kabul, which was a good way, I think, of connecting my position as a woman from India, which I felt led me to relate to the city in a way which was very different from what women from around the world or women I met from around the world had a relationship with. So for instance, like the fact that you couldn't go out in the evenings, that was just normal for me. And in fact, as I wrote in the book, in many ways, having grown up in the kind of environment I did seemed to be ideal training for having gone to Kabul at that time. So this was my approach to writing about this city. And I will say again, as a journalist, I found that I was using a different voice when I was writing about it for news media or even for feature stories. I had the journalistic voice that very much limited the city. I would feel this dissonance when I would be writing about it, that I was leaving out all the interesting bits. That there's a difference between talking about the reality of the city and just simply stating the facts of the city. And I think what I was missing was being able to communicate the reality of being in Kabul, which was a holistic thing, it involved all your senses, it involved memory, it involved history, it involved the way you carried yourself through the streets even. How do you bring all that into journalism? I think is a really interesting question, and I feel it truly belongs in journalism. I don't see my work as being separate from journalism at all. I think this is narrative nonfiction writing, very much in the tradition of war reportage. I would say this is a book about many things, but it's also writing about war, because war isn't just something that happens on the front lines, especially in a city like Kabul. It's so evident to see how it embeds itself in the everyday lives of civilians. For instance, in one chapter I wrote about the epidemic of drug use among people in Afghanistan. And of course, this is a legacy of war. The way in which children are addicted to drug use, the way in which women are now, were at that time, and of course now facing the challenges of trying to recover from drug use. Of course, this is all imprints of 40 years of war on Afghans. And I feel it's important to sort of widen the idea of what writing about war can look like, to include voices like this. Having said that, I also feel that this approach was multi-genre, and I also feel it's important to be open to letting in different kind of techniques. And especially when it came to writing about Kabul, I was very sure I didn't want this book to be memoir, because which is what usually publishers will push a book like this towards, because it's a format I think that's acceptable, that's easily publicized. But for me, the idea of the story of the journalist was definitely less interesting than the story of the city. So I was keen to have my own presence there as much as it was required to open up the city or to connect my presence to my own heritage or my own background, and then to open up the city for the reader in a different way. But the heroine of this book had to be the city. So for this, I had to sort of, adopt many, many different techniques. And I think, again, this is something maybe a little more of interest to journalism students or to journalists, that I feel these are all spaces where journalistic voices can venture, because this is reportage, but it is reportage that takes into account many other more diverse sources and diverse voices. I think I'll stop there, and maybe we can continue with some questions.
Thank you so much. Very interesting, to hear how did you go and how did you start writing about the book. So any obstacles you felt or any obstacle you faced while interacting with people or while you're kind of doing your research on how to write the book?
Yeah, that's a good question, Bilkis. But I mean, really, the book kind of grew organically from my time there. So I didn't go to Kabul to write a book, which I think is very important in the kind of book I could write, because truly the reason I could write this book was because the Afghans, the Kabulis I would spend my time with, who I worked with, who were my friends, they just let me into their lives in this incredibly generous way. And just by spending time with them, I could interact with the city with intimacy. I had this fantastic access. At the time I didn't think of it as access, but in journalistic terms, I suppose that's what I would describe it as. But I could just, sit with them, listen to their stories, go to dinners, go on picnics. All of this gave me a relationship with the city. I think that's very much reflected in the kind of book I wanted to write. And really, I mean, if it hadn't been for this openness, for this sharing, there is no way I could have written this book. So, of course, there were obstacles in the sense of, the increasing security situation becoming worse and worse. And also, I think once I started writing the book, the challenge for me was to find a structure for it. That, of course, that was independent of the situation in Kabul. This was more internal to me. But I was very keen for it to be a structure where the reader could wander as freely in their imaginations as I had wandered in the Kabul of these many, many stories. And I also was very keen, and this is something that's quite rare with places like Kabul, I was very keen that readers should be able to see it as a city that possibly they knew or that they could imagine. Because there is always a sense of distance when we talk about cities like Kabul, which is that they are war-ravaged, they are perennial either violence or just sort of suffering despite violence. It's not a place that you can relate to, in the sense that you wouldn't think, hey, this sounds like a place that I know, or it reminds me of a place that I know. I wanted readers to be able to make those connections. So this was something I worked on fairly long even after I had finished the reporting of the book. This was really my big sort of journey in terms of the writing. But yeah, in Kabul, I mean, the usual kind of situation that I faced while working, but not anything specifically for writing the book.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm sure there are many points that we can take it up in our discussion. And I just want to announce that Nemat Saadat has got some problems, so he won't be able to join us today. So now the floor is open for questions, discussion. I would like audience to, feel free, either leave your questions in the chat box, I will take it up, or if you really want to have a conversation, you can unmute yourself and talk with our speakers. So now I also would like to invite speakers and the organizer, if you want to ask something that you want to ask from each other, like Seistela and Teren, you both have different perspectives of Afghanistan, right? Seistela Thief, sorry for being so informal. You have learned about Kabul maybe from your parents because they have never visited, right? But Teren, though being an Indian, she have a very strong connection with Kabul, right? So maybe you both can have things to talk to each other.
Hi, Teren, can you see me?
Yeah.
Okay, there, great. Yeah, so I guess it's like, sometimes I think about, again, like going back to the question of who has the right, to tell the story, right? Like, is it the person who it gets to be physically in that space, on that land, being able to see it in person, and you go, you know, comparatively, just out of curiosity, not that I'm making any kind of statement, where you go, who would have more of an authority to speak on that region or that city, right? I'm curious, even just for the, you know, audience that's watching, like, you know, if you had to think about this, like, who would have the authority? Would it be someone who's grown up in an Afghan family, who's a product of that displacement, who's never been back home, who's a Westerner, or is it someone who is, you know, close, you know, in region as well, who has been able to go there, who has, you know, a grandparent who's also studied with a lot of care and respect this region? So it's like, who has the authority, you know? And if that's even the right question about, you know, who, you know, authority, even using that word, you know, in a story. Yeah, I'm just curious about that. Even for you, Teren, like, did you struggle with having this kind of authority to kind of write the story and this access?
That's a really great question, Seistela. And I think my response to that is simply that I've always felt this, that there is such a need for diversity in my talking about Afghanistan. I mean, I would really just argue for there to be as many voices as possible, because this is a space that is so deeply, in a way, it's such deeply written terrain. It feels like we've been hearing about it forever, but it's so poorly understood. And for me, as someone based in India, located in India, my news about Afghanistan after 2001 mostly came from Western media sources, you know, which made, if you think about it rationally, it makes no real sense, because we're so much closer to Afghanistan than you know, any of the other media organizations were. And yet we depended on that route for news about our neighborhood. So, and again, if you go further back, it's deeply written terrain, mostly from a tradition of Western writers, mostly male Western writers. And I feel that I've read that work. Part of the reason why I felt so enriched by my grandfather's inputs was that he could draw on all of that, and then so much more. Like, he could draw on, for example, the Shahnameh, which I mean, it's something that belongs to Persian speakers around the world, including India. And he would tell me these stories about, for example, Princess Rudaba, who's one of the characters in the Shahnameh. And she's a princess of Kabul. And he told me this beautiful love story about how she falls in love with Zal. And she's never seen him, and he's never seen her, but they fall madly in love without having seen each other. And, you know, she has to fight for her happiness. She's you know, there's opposition to the marriage. But Rudaba says, you know, this is what she wants. So, having learned this little bit of knowledge about the Shahnameh, about Kabul as a place of a feisty princess, as a place of love and longing, when I would go back there, it would change how I saw the city. And I think this is why I feel so strongly, and why I keep saying that as much as possible, really, as many voices as possible, not just depending. And I think the idea of authority resting in any one of these voices is really where we should be putting our interrogation, you know, because truly, even as a woman writing about Kabul, I went through a process where I had to sit down and ask myself, because almost everything you read in English about Afghanistan, about Kabul, comes from authority figures, what we call authority figures. To see the stories I had seen and the voices I had heard as being worth telling, as being stories that added an image to the city and added something to an understanding of the space. That was a process for me, you know, to see myself, my own heritage, my own body, even in Kabul, not as a liability, not as something I had to struggle to overcome to write a book, but as an asset or as an entry point into a different version of the city. This was a real journey, you know, and I think for me, this was the learning, that the point is always to see where do we assign authority. And this is very much in my case, it was very much within my own mind where I chose to assign authority. The minute I chose to understand that the voices I had heard of interiors of women, you know, of so-called trivial moments were fantastic. They were definitely worth telling. That was, I think, when I felt the freest in terms of writing this book. So I think it's a really interesting question, and it's just something we have to constantly engage with. But I really do, value the fact that there's this, for instance, there's this work in translation by an Indian writer from the 1920s called In a Land Far From Home, in the English translation. And reading that, it was just so interesting for me because he was there during the time of King Amanullah's modernization drive, and he was able to provide this completely different perspective on it because he was also looking at Afghanistan as a place that was free of colonialism. And of course, for an Indian at that time, to be going to a free country was a trip, So there's that's the whole thread that runs through this memoir. Yeah, I mean, I hope that answers your question, but these are all questions
No, it does.
Engage
It
with.
does beautifully. It does beautifully. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate also just what you said earlier in the in your other answer too, is just like, making a kind of text in the same way that you were embodied in that space and moving around, that you can also have the readers interact with that text as if they were walking, in Kabul and interacting with that as well. And I think, I think it is really important to think about, what do we consider expertise or authority? But often I also think about this, what was also making me think, with your generous answer is that borders and regions did not exist in the ways that we know now, right? And so when I brought up this thing of what does it mean when diaspora are asking Pakistan to be sanctioned, right? It's kind of an absurd demand for me to ask, like, who are you asking to sanction the violent military powers that have come in and have created these sanctions that have suppressed and repressed many cultures and many people and many nations? Like, where is this coming from? So there's this miseducation also in terms of like, what was the history of Afghanistan? What other regions was it connected to? But also, there is this narrative too of like Afghanistan belongs to everybody, right? And this other type of thing that I've heard many years as well, that Afghanistan is like the center of the world, because it kind of represents this like land strategic place as well. So on one hand, it has to be respected in its own sovereign nation or state. But what does it mean when we make a state, right? What does it mean to account something as a state or as a sovereign state? And then the other aspect of it is like, there's this very dark thought that I have at times that sometimes I have a hard time articulating. So forgive me if it's a little bit messy, where, I want it to exist. I want this place called Afghanistan, or what has been known as Afghanistan the last couple of 100 years, before it was called Ariana, before it called many other names, and I want it to exist. And on the other hand, I don't want it to exist. And that is a very dark, terrible feeling that I have, as well as someone who's, living outside of it too, because I feel so exhausted at this idea of ownership and possession and authority and having to defend something over and over again in a land. And then I go, what is a nation state? What are these nationalisms, whether we're from India, whether from Pakistan, from Afghanistan, from these other countries? Like, what is this nationalism that I see an emergence of in especially in diaspora culture as well, without having any sort of access or living experience there? Like, what does it mean to be so nationalistic of a country that you've never set foot in, right? So I'm also curious about exploring those questions too. So that's what it also makes me think of too.
Sure, yeah. We have lots of questions from audience, and I'm just clubbing questions. So two questions from you, Seistela Thief. One question is that, how do you see your life if you would have not been in Canada, if your parents wouldn't have migrated? And the second question is, how is the 1987 displacement different from or similar to the current ongoing displacements?
Those are two very big questions. So I will try my best to answer it. I think one, when I was younger and I was guided by people in the professional industry that were outside of my culture, who didn't have a lot of understanding of cultural dramaturgy or narrative study, is that oftentimes, there's this hyper thinking of like, oh, if I was back home, if I grew up there, I would be repressed, I would be subjected to violence, I would never be able to have a voice, I would never have joy, I would never have happiness, right? So that's the kind of I think, push that I was having to have, that if I, which also feeds into a very toxic, terrible narrative, right? Of like, thank God Canada saved us and we're in the savior state that protected me from my own repression. But I don't know. I believe that I would have probably, this isn't as, again, please take my answers with charity. I'm just, Western in so many ways, but I think I would still experience a lot of joy. I would experience life. I would experience grief and sorrow and all those wonderful things that I experience here. So it's hard for me to sit too much in that fantasy, because it's a very dangerous one to kind of explore, to be like, what would my life be like? So that's, I think that's, I would answer it probably differently. I'm 35 now. I would probably answer it differently at the beginning of my career when I was 20, 21 years old, being like, oh my goodness, I'm here and I would have been this. And then now looking back at it, I even know it's real. It's very real that as a queer woman, as a independent person, who's also separated from my family. I don't live in a family home. I live on my own. Those kinds of things might not be permitted to me within that culture. Right. But I also know that there's other types of empowerment that also exist for women there as well. So I don't know. I kind of oscillate between like being very careful, but not digging in too much of it, and being like joy and happiness and life is possible everywhere without it being, pivoted towards like, only Western happiness. And then what's the difference between 1987 and now? That's a really hard question to answer. There's many differences, and there's also many similarities. I think one of the differences is that there's been a lot more time for the war machine to expand from 1987 until now. So 35 years later, I think what has been, given to all, to the Soviet invasion, the end of the Soviet invasion, the America's support, all of that is that they have been able to spend 35 years building global bases and militarization around the world, like using Afghanistan as like, a point of which they can expand their dominance. So I think that's one difference. And I think the other aspect of it is that, you have a government that has been corrupted by a lot of international presence as well. So it's a very hard question to answer, to be perfectly honest. I'm not the most eloquent in it, because I'm trying my best to do it as concisely as possible. But I think the technology has advanced. The way that people have been scattered in terms of even understanding the situation. The historical memory has diminished, right? Like people can't even remember what has happened like 20 years ago, when the beginning of war on terror happened. So I think what's become really dangerous in these 35 years is that, these governments can really depend on the diminishment of people's memories and their historical amnesia to keep, expanding on their dominance. And I think that's the other aspect of, being responsible as like creators, as writers, as journalists, is making sure that our responsibilities attached to the proliferation of the message and the proliferation of this information, so people can have more of a hand in understanding how we are manipulated by these stories and by this military presence, right? That they're not there to save, they're there to extend and elaborate on their violence.
Thank you. Yeah, both were very interesting, but also very difficult question to answer. Yeah. Two questions for Teren Han. The first question is that what were the kind of social challenges that you faced, like when you were in Kabul? Like, what were the things that made you connect or not connect with local population there? And the second question is that to what extent do you think your experience of Kabul or India affect your stories or articles? Because the audience are asking that, because being a journalist also means that you have to be neutral, but sometimes, we also can't help it that sometimes our own kind of biases, why not purposely, also kind of affect our stories. So.
Great questions, both of these. Thank you so much for asking. I'll take the second one first. And I don't know if you've already covered this in journalism class, but I think neutrality is a myth. We can't be neutral as journalists in the best of circumstances. And I think while writing about spaces like Kabul, it's exceptionally difficult. And my solution, which I've worked out personally for myself in terms of the book, of course not in terms of news writing, is to foreground my own, is to make it very clear that this is my voice, these are my impressions, and here's why I'm reacting this way to this place or to these voices or to this relationship. It will change depending on the format of the writing. And I think, having said that neutrality is a myth, of course, the idea of journalism being, I think, essentially a public service, a service for, that serves the interests of the readers. This is the important thing to keep in mind. This is our job, is to report as best as we can with a diversity of sources, without any agendas from our own side, without trying to misrepresent or put any kind of fake news in our work. It's become so, it's become so easy to sort of diss journalists and journalism, and it's understandable in a way. But I really feel that Kabul in a way really showed me how important it was to spend time with writing, to spend time with news, to spend time with your sources, to spend time understanding a place or a question when you were trying to write about it. Because this is a luxury, especially in India. We don't have the resources to really invest deeply in our reportage. But at the same time, this is something that we can do, even on, I think, the most routine of assignments, is to keep an open mind and to just get in there knowing that we don't know much. I think that's a really good approach to getting into complicated questions, is to assume that you don't really know much and to educate yourself, not only through anecdotes, not only through stories that you read, but do the research, get into the archives, read like the secondary sources, really just do the footwork and the reading required from the assignment, And from there, I think if the assignment allows, then dig into how you want to talk about it, how you want to approach it. It is possible to be completely upfront about the fact that you are invested in the story. I think that's really important. But it's also where that's not an option, where you're reporting a story, then to certainly be a good journalist and to remember that your job is to report. It's not to editorialize or to push agendas in that situation. What is the second question?
The second question was about your social challenges you might face in Afghanistan.
I mean, so following from that, and like I spoke about this a little bit earlier, I wasn't there as a journalist. I was there living and working in the city, mostly working with media professionals or producers or journalists. So my challenges as such were those that were faced by people in the city. They weren't specific to my job as a journalist. But over the years, what I saw from 2000, say maybe around 9 onwards, as the security situation deteriorated, the city completely transformed, and physically. And you could see more and more security barriers coming up. You could see more of the concrete glass walls coming up. If you walk down a street that was there on the previous journey, I would find half of it kind of vanished behind these security apparatuses. So it also became much bigger, kind of grew beyond the traditional boundary of the mountains around it. It pushed beyond that, and the sprawl became larger and larger. Of course, the infrastructure couldn't really keep up, so there were a lot of problems for ordinary Kabulis. But at the same time, I could see that people were able to, for instance, people I'd worked with who had been refugees previously were able to buy a home, to build it, to contemplate a future for their family in those cities. Of course, it's incredibly poignant for me to be remembering these places now, as I'm sure it is for everyone who has a connection with Kabul, because the city is completely transformed now, and the idea of a future there is a very different one. Which is to say that it was a complicated relationship with the idea of moving around the city, which changed over time. It wasn't something that stayed the same. So, and I would encourage, like, what I find always interesting in questions like this is that we tend to come back to sort of talking about issues like, you know, like that's the only way we have to talk about Kabul or a place like Kabul. I think for me, the interesting point is always to go beyond this and to think of it in terms of wider categories or just the experiences of people who live there, who work there. How does that feel? What is like an everyday day? What did it feel like to be bored in Kabul, for instance? You know, between 2006 to 13, did you just get bored? Were there days when you just sat in the sun and, you know, relaxed? So all of those are interesting lenses, I think, more than to simply look at it in terms of issues or solutions.
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting to see how, you know, someone who, you know, from abroad see the city Kabul, you know, compared to someone who has lived there or someone whose parents lived there but not her, right? Very interesting, you know, different lenses. Yet another question from Seistela Thief, that the question is that how do you think women in Afghanistan would get a voice if not through Western media or through local media? So how will they get their voice be heard?
Okay. How could they get their voice? They already have voice. They already have a voice. They already have voices. They're already speaking. They're already protesting. They're already present. They already have these movements. They have already been in process. So I think it's also like thinking about what do we legitimize as someone having a voice, right? What is made legible as having a voice, right? So, you know, how can I don't really think the Western media is the channel in which Afghan women get their own voices. They have their own platforms. They have their own media to be able to source. Right now, of course, people are being silenced and pushed into exile. But again, this question goes, it's a very hard one because I also think of how much journalism and how much these spaces and platforms have changed over years, because sometimes, you know, in the old times, they would have someone stationed for a period of time in the region, right? Who got to live amongst the people, who got to be among the culture and the experiences and got to report on what was happening. Now, because you have such extreme advanced capitalism, like, you know, you don't have people that are stationed for long periods of time to learn about the region and the country, to really report about it, you know, in this, you know, quote unquote neutral way, because they're there to report it on a deep way. You have people that are different kinds of, journalists that come in that make their money off of exploiting this strife, this displacement, this violence, and then also occupying the space of speaking for the women back there because they become these personalities to do so. So I really don't think the Western media channel is the way that we should even be focusing on or driving, you know, our attention towards to kind of get legitimacy. I think they do exist. And I think what Teren said as well is like, you know, just finding your own avenue, educating yourself and becoming familiar with these platforms are really important. But I think it's really dangerous to depend on Western media because they're bought and sold. They are part of corporations. They are part of businesses that get to manipulate what kind of stories are told. So, you know, the other aspect of it is like, you know, to when we talk about highlighting these stories, I think oftentimes it's used to comfort people who do have a great deal of like privilege and access, right? Who want to be comforted and want to have some feel good stories or some kind of triumphant story, you know, over, you know, overcoming this strife and becoming a new refugee, or overcoming the strife and, you know, being able to have a business and overcoming the strife and still being able to exist and whatever it is. And I really, you know, don't believe in those kinds of stories at all times. I do believe in kind of seeing the complication, seeing the lack of legibility, but also like thinking about like what are the kind of counter narratives that need to come out in the next little while from that region. And I'm very curious to know who's going to be responsible for those counter narratives, right? And it won't be people like myself who are from the diaspora, but I wouldn't know how to, I wouldn't know how to give more voice to them. And I think that's a really, it's an interesting question to ask, but it's a tough question for me to answer because I think they already have it. You know, maybe we're not able to see it and hear it.
Definitely, definitely. So
Yeah.
a connecting question, talking about Western media, right? A connecting question is another one from you that, we all know that media representation has a very important role in shaping public opinion. So how your Afghani identity often clashed with your daily life in Canada, since Afghanistan has been portrayed in a very negative light?
I think one is to become very familiar with the Canadian military being an active partner with the US military. I think one is to become very, very aware that my presence here means the active dispossession and destruction of another other, right? So if I'm not able to be back home, to be amongst my people in my homeland, then it is my responsibility here to become very hyper aware in terms of how my taxes, my money, my education is all funding this dispossession globally, right? And then also just really, so the tension is that, we have an arts and cultural industry here that has only been really formulated in the last like 50, 60 years with the creation of Canada Council for the Arts. So I'm telling you very quickly like how this plays into how I'm able to tell these stories is because, most of the time arts and culture like can emerge from periods of revolution. Mm-hmm. Right. And you have a country in which I exist on, in which it's a genocidal history, right? It only exists because it genocided over 100 million, indigenous tribes and people, right? So when I think of that aspect, I go, okay, as an artist who, I don't take state funding, I refuse to apply for state funding. All of that is part of my refusal in being part of this system, even though I'm on this land. But I think the thing is that I have to be able to confront my own government that I exist on, that I pay into, and my own state. And my job is to also educate people and say, the Canadian presence is not this peacemaker. Years ago when people would travel, after 9/11, they would put on a Canadian flag on their backpacks instead of the American, right? Because that would, and so like grant them safer passage, in parts of the world, right? Because there has been such an intentional, a story of like Canada being there to help, to be supportive, you know what I mean? To guide people. They're like the lesser, gentler type of Americans, right? But they're just as volatile. So when I'm talking about as an artist here, I have so much pushback in terms of how I'm programmed, how I'm presented. Like they would much rather hear from a person who doesn't have a strong stance against the military, who's from the diaspora, to talk about their parents' immigration story, than they would to hear me do a performance lecture on how much our military budget has increased in the last 6 years, which has been alarming. It's it's going to grow in additional 70% than what it was. And for me, that should awaken everyone to realize that we actually play an active hand in the demise of Afghanistan. This is not a separation, right? So I think, people often think of these stories as being distant from it, right? And then you create these like false narratives, you create these mythologies about this country, you wipe your hands clean of it, but there's a direct correlation. One more thing that I'll tell you, like even the Canadian government, at the start of 2020 had run this like a psyop, and this was a huge story that came out, but a lot of people didn't read into it because they're like, whatever, because it's so out there, was that they were using the same kind of tactics that they were in Afghanistan, to kind of avoid having people go to school, right? And to going to these madrasas, is that they would announce that there's going to be like, pedophilia or molestation at these schools. So even though education was made available to all genders and all people, there was this intentional like speaker service and things that would go around these villages and towns spewing out these, falsehoods about pedophilia and all this stuff existing at these schools. So then people would prevent their children from going to these schools, even though they're told, I'm here to build these schools, to build an education system, right? But then they recreated the experimentation that they were doing back there to kind of see how far a story can go and a falsehood can go, is that in Nova Scotia, they said that there's a pack of wild wolves that were running around and putting people in danger. And they went as far as going into the forest and playing on a speaker a bunch of very loud wolf noises, right? So the locals could also really believe it. And it's to see how far this falsehood can go. So it's a hard, I'm going to try to connect it as much as I can. But what I'm
Thank you.
saying is
Yes,
that,
yes. I got it.
you know what I mean? It's like, it's that what I'm saying is that is that the war on terror, what is going on in Afghanistan has been a active and experimental breeding ground to continue the ways that they enact, you know, this strife against our people in our homeland to people that are also existing here in the West. So I think it's only a matter of time that those tactics of control will be here. So that's what I'm kind of looking at in general for myself.
Yeah, thank you so
I hope
much.
that answers it.
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much. Actually, we have lots of questions, but we are running out of time. So I really would like to, again, say thank to you and to Teren Han for giving us such an informative talk, and the session was very informative. It was very interesting to see point of views of diasporas and foreigner journalists talking about the same country. And I'm sure it was equally very informative for the participants. So now I think it's time to go to our second panel, but if our speakers have time, then at the end we might have also some time after the second panel for some questions, if there are some questions to be raised. So thank you so much, and I hope you still get connected to Afghanistan and you work from diaspora. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you, Bilqis and Seistela. I really learned a lot.
Same from you. Your answers were so lovely and so generous and so informative. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Good evening. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bilqis, Shaista, and Teren for that really wonderful, sharp discussion. I kind of want to mention that a lot of the students from our who are undergraduate students are here today asking questions. So a lot of it is coming from the student body, which kind of might be clear to you in terms of the descriptiveness of the questions or that you see in the chat. And these are students who are, most of them are in a course on migration and displacement, where they are learning about, sometimes for some of them, for the first time, learning about sort of global sort of displacement and different regions where that's ongoing. So a lot of the questions are from them, and maybe we can come back to it if we have time and if the speakers have time. So thank you again for that wonderful discussion. So now we're going to move on to the second session, titled Narrating Afghanistan Journalism, History, Knowledge Making. Am I audible? Because my okay, because I have some tech issues happening here, but so I'm just going to introduce the panel, and then we're gonna and the panelists, and then we're gonna start. So the relationship between the state and media, especially independent media, is universally a contentious one. The media has been an important tool for nation and community building, and in ideal circumstances, a central democratic institution providing the public with critical and factual information. The International Federation of Journalists Freedom Report 2019-2020 has pointed out that Afghanistan has a varied and dynamic media landscape, combining independent media, dozens of television networks, over 100 radio stations, and many privately owned newspapers. Another report by Freedom House in 2019 stated, and I quote, that journalists in Afghanistan face harassment and threats from the Islamic State militant group, the Taliban, and government-related figures to influence how they are covered in the news. So access to information is one of the crucial points raised by many of these reports that look at the journalistic landscape. And they point out that self-censorship is also among one of the issues, and this is due to security measures. There's hostile work environment of journalists, which we know of particularly currently. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has also created, a different work environment for journalists. The new set of media regulations issued in September 2021 by the Taliban is among the latest of repressive measures on the journalists that we see. According to a report by Al Jazeera, more than 150 media outlets have been closed due to fear of increased intimidation from the Taliban and lack of funding, since international governments have cut off assistance to Afghanistan. So safe working conditions, access to knowledge and information, spread of misinformation, and finally, decolonizing public information are issues that compel us to think about present concerns around media freedom in Afghanistan with some historical acuity. So I'm honored to welcome our panelists to share their insights through the important work that they do on the region. We will follow the same structure as the first panel. Each speaker has about 8 minutes to tell us about their work, after which we will have an interactive session. I'll quickly introduce our panelists. Mirwais Afghan is the owner and chief editor of Khabariyal Media, an independent media portal. Mr. Afghan has worked as a journalist covering issues in Afghanistan, working for the BBC World Service and Reuters out of Kabul. He's currently running Khabariyal Media based in London. Ratib Noori is the chief editor of Radio Azadi. Mr. Noori was a senior correspondent and presenter for Tolo News television network till 2015, after which he worked for the wire service AFP till 2019, covering stories both in Afghanistan and internationally. He's currently based out of Paris, where he is the chief editor of Afghan edition of Radio Free Europe called Radio Azadi. Finally, we have Elizabeth Leek, who is Associate Professor of International History at the University of Leeds. Dr. Leek has worked on the era of decolonization and Cold War with a focus on Afghan-Pakistan borderlands. Her forthcoming book, Afghan Crucible, The Soviet Invasion and the Making of Modern Afghanistan, is a global history of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan between 1979 and 1989. She looks at the intersecting roles of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the Mujahideen, the Afghan refugees, alongside international actors from the Soviet Union, the United States, Pakistan, India, Iran, and China. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. I will first ask Mr. Noori to take the floor, followed by Mr. Afghan and Dr. Leek. Mr. Noori.
Well, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Ratib Noori, as she introduced me already. Thank you for that. I've been working with media outlets since 13 years now. I still was a student at Kabul University when I started my career with the radio in Afghanistan, and then moved on to Tolo TV, which still was only Tolo, and then they established Tolo News in a year or so after I joined. And then I worked for them for, I would count it as 5 years, but in between I went to do my master's in India. And then after that, I joined back Tolo News in 2014, and then worked for them for 1 year, and joining AFP in 2015 and up to 2019. And then went to Radio Azadi. That's a branch of Radio Free Europe, the Afghan service, and I was the chief editor for Afghanistan. I still am holding that position while I'm in exile. I'll basically explain what we did in Radio Azadi, which is the latest I do. So we had 3 sections in this radio. It was basically covering the entire country. And that's why we were a bit more exposed to the risks and threats by the insurgent groups, including the Taliban, who are running the country now. Radio Azadi is a non-profit organization that's supported by the US government. And we broadcast in every single village of Afghanistan through FM and AM antennas, but our FM is limited to 13 provinces of the country. And we still have 3 main sections in the radio. So it's newsroom and political affairs. And then you have educational section. And then we have another project-based section that's called anti-narcotics. And the section is mainly called Caravan of Poison, or Caravan Zahar in Persian, in Dari. So our main operations were to cover Afghanistan and conflict, and also focus on, mainly our mission was to focus on women rights and human rights mainly, and then children rights. We still have a joint production with UNICEF that we produce the programs for Afghan children and about children rights. So that was also one of the things that made us, vulnerable, and we reached every single village of Afghanistan. I think, if I'm not exaggerating, we are the most heard radio in Afghanistan, and then BBC radio comes in, and then other local radios, including Salamat and Dar, that has another small local radios in Afghanistan, And we had a team of 116 people in Kabul and around the country. It was quite a big team for a media outlet in Afghanistan. And we had our reporters in over 20 provinces. And also we produce 12 hours live shows and coverage every day. And the next 12 hours is dedicated to VOA radio. And so that's all about our radio. I'll be happy to take questions. I may actually continue on something that after Kabul was collapsed, and then our colleagues were stuck in Kabul, all of them. But now, luckily, we have taken out most of them. We still have some people there, but we are operating from around the world now, because our main office is regional offices in Prague, Czech Republic. But I'm sitting in Paris, and one of our teams is in Pakistan, who are going to be evacuated soon. And then the other team is in Qatar, the other team is in Serbia. And so it's basically dispersed, and we all come together via these kind of online meetings in the mornings, and we start our day with that. And we have our editorial meeting, and then we distribute the jobs, who does what during the day. And our main coverage is now through WhatsApp, Skype, and phone calls. And unfortunately, we still, we don't have a big, food on the ground now, but still we managed to get information from the journalists who are there, and we are planning to make kind of, contracts with other media organizations who operate locally in Afghanistan.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nouri, for sharing that with us. And I can only imagine what a challenging time this is to be creating and producing news. I have one question, and we can see if there are questions from the audience, and that, or we can come back to it after the other panelists speak. Interestingly, Radio Free Europe was first launched in 1985. I read during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and it was meant to basically bring forward uncensored and objective news. So my question is, and since it is supported and funded by the U.S. government, what is the relationship of independent media journalism to global powers like the U.S.? How much, and in what ways does that kind of relationship play out? Where do we, how does that relationship manifest apart from support and funding?
Well, thank you. I think you're right. It was established around those times in 80s. And the main objective then was to confront what was coming from, from Soviet Union. But then slowly, I think they changed, especially in the last few years. Now our mission is mostly value-based missions, like we promote a lot of other things. We promote the rights of the children, as I said, the rights of women, basically human rights and social economic problems and outcomes. We cover all of that. But I think for the past 20 years, it has been really different for Afghanistan after US overran Afghanistan and invaded in 2001. Then Afghan people started working on their achievements. Then freedom of expression was one of the main achievements of the past 20 years, we would say. And Afghanistan has never experienced such a period of time where they had full freedom of expression. I mean, there were different times in the history when you had relatively, freedom of expression and speech, but never it was the same as it was in the past 20 years. And at least Afghan media and Afghan people were thinking that these values were brought by Western countries, and US playing the main role in that, because it was the biggest supporter of media in Afghanistan, and also it was the biggest supporter of any other, any other development in Afghanistan, whether it was in military aspect, whether it was in investment in Afghanistan. So that was basically the understanding that people were thinking, okay, so now we are grateful for Western countries for providing us, to talk about women's rights, to talk about children's rights, to talk about media, to talk about elections, to talk about, like all these civil society activities. And that's why everybody is and was thinking that US and Western countries especially are the biggest supporters of media and freedom of speech. And that's why they are the ones who can only be a force to support media against any kind of violations coming from the Afghan government and now from the Taliban. But unfortunately, with the Taliban overrunning Kabul on 15th of August, we faced a very critical situation. And we have lost the ground almost, but we, I think, are losing it gradually to zero. And based on the very latest report we had today, so in the past 2 months only, there have been over 30 violence cases against journalists, 90% of them coming from the Taliban and 10% from unknown gunmen persons. We don't know who they are. They could be affiliated to the Taliban, but anyway. And then we have, as you said, over 154 media outlets closed. And then we have in percentage, we have 70% of free media in Afghanistan paralyzed so far in 2 months, and that's a quick, it's a quick change. And that's why I think it's very important to have this understanding of the relation of media, especially in Afghanistan, with the Western countries and with the international community, I would say. And the international community is the only one who has the leverage and the power to press the Taliban and to convince them to meet the commitments they had made in Doha and afterwards. And United Nations has this force to press the Taliban to accept freedom for media and to accept freedom for rights, to accept the rights to education, the access to information, and those kind of things.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nouri. I have one sort of more technical question related to the media. Can you tell us about the role of the radio itself in, having this reach that many other sort of media portals may not have? So how does the radio play a role in sort of expanding access to information and even sort of allowing journalism to or journalists to access information?
Well, looking at the recent developments in Afghanistan, negative developments, if I'm not wrong, I'm just talking about the very latest developments because, this is what we should consider now. With the weak electricity in Afghanistan, we have almost, the big cities have electricity, but not the rural areas. And with people with less education and with a high percentage of illiterate people in Afghanistan, and also with the reach that we have in the villages of Afghanistan, I think now for the majority of Afghan people, radio is the best tool to receive information and to be educated and, to be entertained and to be aware. So also that's the best tool. And I think also it's a good thing for journalists to work easier because now we are operating from different countries around the world. And we have not seen the change in our coverage, and we have not seen the change, like the dramatic change in our quality of the shows and reports, because it's radio. It has given us a free hand to do our job via telephone and using WhatsApp. The only difference is now we don't go to the field, which makes a big difference, but not, it doesn't paralyze our operations. I would say that after COVID spread in Afghanistan, so we closed the office for 3 months and we practiced online working, which worked well. But as soon as we opened office last October 2020, and then the targeted killings started against journalists in Afghanistan. And we also lost one of our colleagues, unfortunately. And I think he was the first one to be at that series of targeted killings. His name was Ilyas Dai, and he was our reporter in South Afghanistan in Helmand. So the targeted killings started with him, though there was another explosion that killed Yamas Yawash, the ex-Tolo News anchor, who wasn't working with media anymore. He was working with Central Bank. But Ilyas Dai was literally the first person that the Taliban started, killing journalists after that in a series of attacks. So it was on November 12th. And then after he was killed, we closed our office. So it's not like we closed it after the Taliban came. So we had closed it already in November 2020. So we practiced almost a whole year with closed office and working online. But But still, there was a difference because at least our reporters in the provinces were operating and they were going to the field. But to be focused and to come to your point again, so it's good for the people. Radio is a very easy tool to achieve and to listen to learn from, and to be aware of the situation. And it also is good for the journalists who are working, because they can work, they don't have pictures, so they can work online and they can record their voices and they can do reporting.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nouri. We'll come back to you with questions after the other panelists speak. I'm wondering if Mr. Afghan has been able to join. He had some technical difficulties in joining a little earlier. I'm not sure if he's here yet. Maybe while we wait for Mr. Afghan, I can request Dr. Elizabeth Leek to share with us her perception, her insights into the current situation of Afghanistan with a historical perspective. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Riju, so much. So I'm going to try, I guess I'll try to keep this brief. I have to say, I'll probably be predominantly actually focusing, I think, on the historical context rather than the current circumstances. I think you'd originally mentioned kind of talking a bit about my research. So I suppose wanted to link it to some of the points, I suppose, that have come up so far. And I've really been enjoying the conversation that's been taking place, both in this the first panel and this one. So I thought I would perhaps provide kind of a little bit of context, and I guess maybe discuss one or two points that have come out of my research, and maybe draw some broader issues. So I should say I'm trained as a historian and trained as kind of an international or global historian at that. And my research then in that context has really been focused on 20th century South Asia in a both an international and global context. So my first book looked at the Afghan-Pakistan borderlands from roughly the 1930s to the 1960s 1960s as a site of prolonged state violence, and sort of asking the question as to why and how has it been that so many sort of, I suppose, great powers or state leaders have justified the use of violence against local populations on both sides of the Duran line throughout the 20th century. And my research sort of linked it not only to processes of decolonization and state building in both Pakistan and Afghanistan, but also the global Cold War. I think in that sense, I think there were a couple of points that I wanted to sort of bring up, and that then ultimately led to my second book, which is coming out next year, on the Soviet invasion. And so my research, I suppose, kind of things that I've wanted to do with my historical research, which I think sort of link to some of the points that Seistela brought up and Teren brought up, and kind of thinking, I guess, about Afghanistan's place in the world, is that I hope, at least that my research is disrupting sort of these histories of Afghanistan as being exceptional, and also certainly histories that exclude Afghanistan from international relations in the 20th century. And likewise, too, my work is really about kind of interrogating the tropes around the sort of graveyard of empires narrative that, of course, has been, I think, very, very common in Western media perspectives, kind of Euro-American perspectives on Afghanistan, both in terms of reflecting on the modern day and also the longer, Afghanistan's longer history. I suppose my real kind of, intervention in that respect, though, has been to kind of bring real focus onto the 20th century. I think we've seen a lot of sort of causation, particularly sort of in, I'd say, American analysis pieces lately, where, you know, in terms of drawing correlations between Afghanistan's 19th century history and events in the 21st century, and the 20th century in that respect has really sort of received short shrift in a lot of ways. So I guess one way that I'm hoping to sort of bring attention then to 20th century Afghanistan has been through this new history of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And what I've tried to do in this book then is to sort of kind of untangle and sort of excavate many of kind of the interests and activities then of a lot of the different groups who became involved in the conflict and the civil war that persisted throughout the 1980s. I guess just to kind of say a couple of words then really briefly about that book and about that project. Firstly, I think I was really listening, I think, carefully and deeply, and really thinking during the first panel about this question of who has the right to tell the story of Afghanistan or Afghan history. And I was also thinking not only in terms of the question of rights, but also responsibility. So who has the responsibility for kind of excavating and unveiling some of these histories? As I said, I'm certainly trained, I would say, as a history of kind of global history and kind of global dynamics or international history. So I should say my book is certainly not, I would say, kind of an on-the-ground history of the Soviet invasion and the Civil War. And it's certainly not, I would say, in that respect, an Afghan history of the Afghan conflict. Instead, it's very much looking at certainly different Afghan social and political groups, but also their interactions then, not only with, let's say, American covert agents or Soviet state builders, but certainly then governments in Pakistan, Iran, and India, as well as international organizations like the United Nations and UN High Commissioner for Refugees. So it's a very tangled story. And my focus is kind of looking at kind of the different encounters between these groups to understand kind of how and why this conflict persisted in various ways, the different visions that emerged during the conflict, and I suppose some of the disappointments that also emerged from it. But it's not necessarily, I would say, telling, I guess, kind of a social history, socio-cultural, on-the-ground history of Afghanistan during this time period. I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily the person best equipped to do that. But one point I do want to bring up then, I think that's become really clear to me in terms of researching this book, is that if we think about the sorts of historical resources and archival materials that are available for studying Afghanistan, I think what becomes really interesting, and I think is really important, is to think about the ways that Afghan voices and perspectives can be found in so many different types of archival materials. I think one of the things that's really important to think about is because the Afghan Civil War of the 1980s was in so many ways a fundamentally global event, it also has correspondingly left very much a global paper trail, though not necessarily an even one. So in that respect, I suppose for historians or students of Afghan history, there are so many sort of amazing and rich repositories for kind of, I suppose, excavating certain sort of perspectives or shedding light on different sorts of dynamics of the time. So certainly the United Nations and UNHCR offer really rich materials, particularly in the correspondence too with local Afghan representatives. Likewise, the Reagan and Carter administrations have left a huge amount of reporting and data, though of course there's a data that very much draws on British colonial era tropes that very much focus on and foreground Afghanistan and Afghans as being tribal, backwards, and unsuited to statecraft, which I think is obviously a really important point in terms of thinking about these kind of continuing stereotypes and continuing kind of problematic lenses of analysis that certainly continue to shape a lot of Western reporting on this region. But likewise, too, we think you can use the Soviet Union's or now Russia's state archives as well to continue to kind of excavate some of these perspectives, as well as the numerous sorts of materials that are available that have been digitized. And I would say in particular, the Afghan Center at Kabul University and their digitization projects have really, are such an amazing and rich resource, I think, for anyone who's interested in understanding various socio-political and cultural dynamics. Apologies, there's a bell ringing in the background. So in that sense, I really want to make the point though that in terms of sort of thinking about these different perspectives and to kind of trace this history, there are these very rich materials out there. In terms of what I'm trying to do with the book itself, then, I just want to make, I suppose, two points, one of which I've already touched on. First is, of course, that the Civil War was this fundamentally global event. And in that respect, we can see that then in terms of the actors who were involved in the conflict. But I think then the other thing that's really important to emphasize as well, and particularly in sort of questioning this history of Afghan exceptionalism or Afghan parochialism that continues to sort of dominate some media narratives, is to really recognize the ways in which Afghanistan and Afghans have been global throughout the past. And so if we think about preceding decades and centuries, we can think about Afghanistan's economy being rooted in trade links expanding north, south, east, and west. We can think about shared histories and practices of poetry and literature and language spanning South Asia and the Middle East, as well as, of course, Afghan leaders' really key roles in the 1955 Afro-Asia Conference in Bandung, and also their help founding the non-aligned movement in 1961. And I think the sort of global perspective and kind of the global movement of ideas and global engagements are really important kind of historical corollary then for better nuancing our understanding of some of the dynamics today. And I was really actually struck with what Ratib Nouri was saying too, particularly about the significance of radio. And what immediately sprang to my mind was Majid Masumi's work at Stanford about the histories of radio in Afghanistan and kind of their international linkages. And her scholarship is really fantastic, but again, really speaks to these various global linkages that Afghanistan has been embedded in throughout the past, but certainly particularly in the 20th century. So in that respect, I think one of the things that becomes really clear is that I think the 1980s is this really important moment, this extremely complicated and in some respects extremely, extremely violent moment as well that has had these really lasting ramifications. I suppose in terms of thinking about histories of the media as well, I think certainly in the 1980s as well, we can see as well these longer histories of attacks on the media and knowledge production and knowledge representation. I think if we think, for example, with the assassination of Syed Bahauddin Majru in Peshawar in 1987, for publishing a survey about kind of local Afghans' desires for Afghanistan's political future, we can see there's kind of question too about not only the key role that I suppose kind of Afghan media personas have had in representing and engaging with and interrogating what Afghanistan's future should be like, but also then seeing how these figures who've been so key in I suppose providing information about Afghanistan's political futures and presence have also then as a consequence often been targets of violence. I would say just really briefly, there are I think a lot of different parallels we can draw between I suppose some of the events around the Soviet invasion and Soviet withdrawal, especially in terms of the discussions around the Geneva Accords that the UN negotiated talks that led to the Soviet withdrawal, especially in comparison to some of the talks that took place in Qatar. But I also think we need to do so and look at those sort of connections and parallels very carefully and with nuance as well, and avoid just sort of drawing straight parallels between the two, because of course so much did change between the 1980s and today. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. I have a quick question for you. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the era of decolonization and its impact on shaping information and global knowledge on Afghanistan. Do we see continuities from the colonial period, or is there a particular shift that happens during the Cold War era and the decolonization?
I think it's a really great question. I guess in terms of what we see, I guess there are a couple of things. I'd say firstly, I do think from really quite an early stage in the Cold War, so really from the early 1950s onwards, what's really interesting to look at is the ways that certainly American officials in the sort of Cold War context very much engaged actively with British colonial officials and read British colonial works deeply on British encounters with Afghanistan. And so that knowledge base really continues then to shape particularly American, but also to an extent Soviet sort of perspectives on an engagement with Afghanistan. And particularly, as I said, this kind of continued focus on the tribe as a key socio-political unit, and also kind of using that in a very kind of in a very civilizational way in terms of kind of the civilizational discourse, and then linking it, I think, to kind of these ideas about the possibilities for success or failure when it came to state building in Afghanistan. I think really one of the really key ways, though, that I suppose decolonization has shaped the region, of course, it is to do with the Durand Line as well, and kind of the questions around the legality of colonial era borders, their appropriateness, the extent to which they matched local lived realities, the extent to which they didn't, and the extent to which they would be or would not be recognized by the international community. And I think some of the kind of the tensions and ambiguities around that, I think, have been particularly durable, and have certainly had real ramifications, particularly for regional relations between Afghanistan and Pakistan, but also then too for the movements of people and civilians across the border.
Thank you so much for that. We're going to come back to you with audience questions, but I just want to check if Mr. Afghan has been able to join us. He has been facing some technical issues, and I'm not sure if he's been able to join us yet. Okay, doesn't seem like he's here yet. So I'd request our students and anyone else here today, some of our faculty are here and other panelists, if you would like to ask your questions, you can unmute yourself and ask your questions, or you can type them on the chat. Questions? I think we have one question which says, do you think that history has been repeating? I think that's a very pertinent question really for us to think about. How do we find sort of processes that repeat themselves or kind of continue? Would Elizabeth like to take that question?
Sure. I mean, I think I'd say yes and no. I mean, I think I'm always really wary of just saying that history is repeating itself. I think the point made earlier on by another panelist that obviously the circumstances now are in many ways extremely different from those in the 1980s or before, is really important. I mean, and certainly in terms of militarization, certainly in terms of, I suppose, I think in particular a real focus in the 21st century, I suppose, on kind of on the very tangled relationship between counterinsurgency and state building, which was not, I'd say, which was the relationship between those two was very different in the 1980s. I think one of the points, though, that where there has perhaps been repetition is in this question around political negotiations and who's involved, and who has been allowed to be involved and who's been leading the conversation. You know, if we think about something like the Geneva Accords in the 1980s, you know, what was really, I think, in some way, well, was certainly problematic, but what is also particularly telling was that in terms of Afghan representation in the Geneva Accords, it was only the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, so the Afghan Communist Socialist Party, that was allowed to take part. So in terms of Afghan representations, they were the only group at the bargaining table. And so I think I think that raises a really interesting question then in terms of, I think particularly in terms of sort of international relations, you know, who is being allowed to represent, I suppose, the Afghan state, you know, and how were negotiations or discussions around that taking place. And I mean, I think there were kind of issues recently, you know, in the last few years too, in terms of who's being allowed to participate or kind of who are the representatives of a potential Afghan political future. And, you know, who I think in this case in particular, if we think about the peace talks in 2020 and 2021, you know, who did the United States recognize as kind of potential Afghan political voices? And as we've seen, I mean, it was quite lopsided, and there have been problems and around that in terms of these sort of assertions of political legitimacy. So I think in terms of thinking about who the international community is recognized, not necessarily in terms of recognizing political legitimacy, but in terms of who they've been willing to have sit around a negotiating table, I think has been quite tangled. And in that respect too, that's certainly had an impact on kind of the political trajectories. So I'd say in that sense, you do perhaps see some comparisons. But I think in terms of something like the forced migration crisis, I do think unfortunately it is a very different situation now versus it was in the 1980s when, I mean, really realistically speaking, in the 1980s, I mean, the Afghan refugee crisis was one of the biggest priorities of the UNHCR. And unfortunately, I think as we've seen today in so much reporting, the international community is not responding to the crisis of forced migration with nearly as much of a sense of urgency. So I think in that sense, we do see a real difference.
Thanks, Elizabeth. We have a question for Mr. Nouri from Kajuri Sen. How aware were journalists about the imminent shifts in Afghanistan, and what was the writing on the wall? Mr. Nouri?
Yes, thank you. I think, first, we'll just go back 2 years almost. When the peace talks started in Doha, they call it peace talks, but we now call it an evacuation deal, a safe evacuation deal of US and Taliban. So when it started 2 years back, and then everybody was very hopeful and it was going well until, US government sidelined Afghan government from being involved in those process. And it's very kind of similar with what Dr. Elizabeth said, in 1988, you had this Geneva Accord being signed between Pakistan and then Afghanistan. But now it was the other way. Now it was Afghan government who was left outside. So it was US and the Taliban, a terrorist group who were talking to each other just to provide a safe passage for the US troops to leave Afghanistan. Well, probably the primary aim was not that. The primary aim probably would have been to have a settled negotiations that would end in a proper, political settlement, which did not happen. So when that one started, and then the Afghan government was sidelined, we were actually expecting things to go wrong, unless there is an involvement of the government. But then on February 29, 2020, this deal was signed between US and the Taliban. And after that deal, when Biden came, Antony Blinken, the state secretary of Biden, sent a letter to the president saying that they want the Afghanistan issue to be wrapped up in 3 weeks or so, 2 weeks. And then Afghan president, former president, he came out and he started, speaking against US. And, he started publicizing himself as if it was a campaign for the elections. But then everybody was so quiet from US side, which was, silence before storm. And we could actually, I personally and my colleagues couldn't analyze what's happening, but we're kind of feeling that things will change because, US is quiet while they had kind of, given a timeline for the president to wrap up the peace talks and make it work in 2 weeks or so. But then we didn't know what's going to happen. Everybody was sure when the Taliban started their offensive attacks around the country, and then districts started collapsing. So that's when a group of media, editors, they went to see, including myself, we went to see National Security Advisor for the president, and we went to see NDS chief, Afghanistan Spy Agency chief, and also Minister of Defense, Minister of Interior Affairs. And they explained saying that the initial plan is for the Afghan forces to, reiterate, to leave those places that are not easy to keep them. So they will back off from those districts and then will be remobilized against Taliban forces to fight better and to keep, provincial capitals and main districts. But then it did not work like that also. And that's when then we were sure that, okay, so now there is another plan, and now the storm has come and Taliban will overrun the country. But still, everybody was predicting that Kabul will at least survive for 6 months. And that's why most of Afghan people, including myself, we had planned, few things to be done in 3 or 4 months. Then we could probably think about, leaving the country just to be on the safe side, or just going temporarily to India or some other place. For me, it was India because I took visas for my entire family. And then I was like, okay, so in 3-4 months, we had certain things to do in the office and in our personal life. And then after that, we were planning to leave Afghanistan just for a few months to see how the situation evolves. But I dropped my parents at the airport on 15th of August. They left to India, and on the way back home. So when we reached home, that was the time when the Taliban entered Kabul and we were stuck then. So it was really, Kabul was really unexpected. But the rest of the country, we could kind of, predict after the districts collapsed.
Thank you so much. I think somebody's microphone be on. If you could just mute yourselves if you're not asking a question. Thank you.
Hi, can I ask a question to Mr. Rathi?
Yes, Shuruki, please go ahead.
Yes. So, I have a question, as it came up again and again in the discussion also, that, we tend to see largely Afghanistan issues from the lens of the Western media. That also came up in the previous discussion. And also now there is a lot of focus on the, the crisis of the Taliban, which obviously has been looked at historically. I just have one question, over the past 20 years in the post 9/11 era, and probably it's a very broad question, how has, journalism reportage changed in Afghanistan? What were the challenges even prior to this current crisis? What were the challenges, day-to-day challenges for journalists in their day-to-day reporting? So if you could, just comment on that.
Well, thank you. Yes, as I said earlier, we were thinking, and the people of Afghanistan, were thinking that the biggest achievement of the past 20 years is journalism and free media in Afghanistan, which we did not have before during the Taliban and Mujahideen. There was only Afghanistan national TV, even during the Soviet Union, and before that. Though in around 1960s and before that, we had other newspapers and weeklies. But past 20 years has been really, a period of the history that is actually highlighted, I think, in the future when we write history about Afghanistan. So I can actually, I can divide Afghan media into 4, categories in past 20 years. So you had state media that still was RTA, or Afghanistan's, radio and television network. Of course, it was a propaganda tool for the government. So then you had international media operating in Afghanistan, like Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and other media. So international media, and then you had some media that was, that was owned and that were operated and operating under, party-based media, I can say. For example, we had TVs and radios owned by political parties in Afghanistan, who were, ex warlords. And then you had another category of media that we can kind of call relatively free media. And this last section actually forms the little percentage of the whole media in Afghanistan. And journalism in these media outlets, the fourth category, were also, affected and influenced by Western media, practicing at least, kind of free speech, though they might have, or they might have their own agendas behind, but at least relatively they were free. And that's how journalism evolved in past 20 years. So you had, I think, the biggest community of journalists that now you see, of Afghan journalists who are in biggest outlets of international media. They came from this, this section and portion of free media. For example, you see a lot of people working with VOA in US now, working with other international media such as New York Times, Wall Street Journal, BBC World, and Al Jazeera, which I don't know if you call it free media. So majority of these journalists working with such big media now are coming from this fourth category of media that's kind of free. But there were a lot of challenges also. For the media, there were financial challenges, but for journalists working in Afghanistan, there were different other challenges. They had, personally, they had job security challenges. While we say that freedom of expression and media, journalists were actually the ones who were defending freedom of expression, and they really were the voiceless in Afghanistan. But working with free media in Afghanistan, they were never asked about their own rights, about their own rights to job immunity, their rights to retirement, their rights to insurance. While, Afghanistan has never been peaceful, and journalism, Afghanistan is one of the places, the dangerous places for the journalists overall. So in personal perspective, they had these kind of challenges. And then, of course, the low payment and those things, and, and then when you come to the access to information and violation of rights by the state and by the insurgent groups, Taliban and other groups, they also face a lot of challenges. For example, if you were willing to do an investigative reporting in Afghanistan, you could have done it, but it wasn't easy. It was really challenging because government of Afghanistan never was able to implement, the law that was called the law of access to information. It really was not able to implement that. They were blocking you at any stage, whether it was a simple report or whether it was an investigative report. It increased at the very last stage in past 4 years, unfortunately, and we faced really difficult, difficult times after Ghani actually took over in 2014. Then slowly, he started putting limitations and restrictions on not on media, but on government institutions. They were not speaking to journalists. They were not giving information away to journalists. Like we ourselves, we had plenty of stories that we left midway because we couldn't complete it. And we were, we were always banned from getting the information that we needed for those kind of reports. And also physically there was a problem of them not being safe, even with the government forces, because they were not aware of the laws, and they were not aware of the laws of access to information, and also they were not aware of the laws of freedom of expression and the civil laws, basically. For example, there were plenty of times that journalists were slapped, beaten up by police forces. I mean, I myself experienced twice. I was beaten up by them because they simply did not know the law and the regulations. They simply were not aware of the rights of a journalist and of the rights they have for the coverage of an event or a suicide attack or any kind of incident.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions remaining? Does anyone want to ask anything else? We've kind of overshot our time for the event, and the Zoom link is only, I think, active for another 5 minutes or so. So I'm going to quickly take the time to thank everybody for being here, for sharing your ideas, your thoughts, and informing us about these times that have been extraordinarily challenging for journalists, particularly in Afghanistan at the moment. And just also want to thank every other panelist here who've brought in so many different perspectives and given us a lot to think about in how we narrate and imagine Afghanistan, and to move forward, what are some of the questions we should pursue, that we should lead with when encountering knowledge, information, or writing to do with Afghanistan. This is going to be an ongoing conversation, so I hope we can continue this discussion at another time. Thank you so much once again, and any last thoughts anyone wants to share, please go ahead.
Well, if I may.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I have one message to say. I think it's a good platform to tell it to, because we have really good people here, and including the panelists and other friends who are there. I think now it's a big responsibility on our shoulders as journalists, civil society activists, human rights activists, and media people overall. This is the time that everybody can be the voice of voiceless. And I think the least we can do is to write about the real ongoing situation in Afghanistan, and just try, avoid, those people who are trying to whitewash the Taliban. And unfortunately, it has been happening in a couple of examples. So I gently request all of you, Seistela Thief is here, Dr. Elizabeth, who has a good pen and writes books, and other friends who are here, to please keep writing about on-the-ground facts in Afghanistan, keep writing about the people's rights in Afghanistan, and that's all we want. And I think it can help a lot, whether you have a Facebook account, whether you have a Twitter account, any other social media account. You can just you can just write about it. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Great. Riju, thank you so much to you and to the other organizers. This is really fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks. We'll be in touch.